Welcome back to another week, everyone. This week, we're going to discuss an emotion that's not very taboo for men, actually. This emotion serves different purposes, but a lot of times we still may not understand it. So today, we're going to dive into anger.
I'm feeling very angry right now.
The only place in the Gospels where Jesus is described as being angry is in Mark chapter 3 and verse 5. The scripture reads in the ESV, "And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. He said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored." The story around this scripture goes a bit like this. Jesus goes into a synagogue on the Sabbath. The Bible doesn't actually tell us what synagogue or where he is at, but we see that on the Sabbath, Jesus goes in, and there are all sorts of people that come in. We're told that there are Pharisees there who are watching Jesus very, very closely. These Pharisees wanted to see if Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, which was considered doing work, which was expressly forbidden to an extreme degree all the way from the time of Moses and forward. Jesus, when he's in the synagogue, calls this man over that has a withered hand. This man has a withered hand that was paralyzed, or it was just unusable. He wasn't able to use it as others can use their hands. When the man comes to him, Jesus looks the Pharisees dead in the eyes and asks them what is actually lawful to do on the Sabbath. And these Pharisees will not give an answer. They just stand there silently, refusing to answer and looking at him. Mark says that Jesus looked around at all of them with anger because he was grieved at their hardness of heart. Do you know how you can see someone just turn red and start fuming? You can see the little cartoon with the blood starting to boil and smoke coming out of their ears. So just imagine this scene with me for 1 minute. The Pharisees' hearts were so set that they could not even enter discussion with Jesus. They just stood there and waited to see whether he would do something outside of the Mosaic law and heal the man's hand or not. So when we think of anger in the gospel writings of the New Testament, the first thing that we think of is commonly Jesus running the merchants out of the temple in Jerusalem. This is debatably the most common example of Jesus being angry. Yet scripture never actually says that Jesus was angry or that he did what he did in an angry manner. Most figure that because he cared deeply about the temple, he probably was not pleased that they were in those places to begin with. This account of Jesus running the merchants out of the temple is recorded in all 4 of the synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of these accounts are similar in that Jesus entered the temple and that he drove out the animals and the merchants. And in 3 of them, he actually quotes what was written in the prophets about this occurrence. There are a few differences in the 4 stories, and John's rendition is the most unique. John says that Jesus drove all of these merchants out with a whip. And a few verses later, John also says that Jesus' disciples remembered a passage that was from the Psalms, that this passage described the Messiah as being consumed with zeal for, quote, your house. This remembrance of a description of zeal is the only thing closely approximating any mention of anger or wrath in this story. Still, Jesus was doubtfully smiling and laughing the entire time that he was running all of these merchants and all of these animals out of the temple. You see, I reckon passionately removing all of these things could be seen as others as like an angrily shooing and getting them out of the temple. We see in the scripture in Mark that Jesus experienced anger as it occurred along with another emotion. He experienced grief, which is akin to sadness or disappointment. So what is our part in all of this? What is anger actually? We have all experienced it, but can we actually define what it is? Can we put it into words? Anger is one of the 7 universal or basic emotions. Although some do claim that it is a secondary emotion, that it happens after other emotions happen or based on other emotions. Anger arises when we are blocked from pursuing a goal and are treated unfairly. It outwardly communicates anything from a mere dissatisfaction to straight up threats. It's a strong feeling of displeasure and belligerence that's aroused by a real or even a perceived wrong. It's possible to experience other feelings simultaneously with anger, such as fear or disgust. Unfortunately, that's not all. There's also physical sensations that go along with anger as well. We feel hot, we start to sweat, Our muscles tense up. We may clench our jaw or our fists and talk with our teeth closed. A lot of these things are natural to us when we feel anger. There's a quote from the Dalai Lama that he says, quote, "Anger is the emotion that most often is implicated in regrettable emotional episodes, including instances in which violence or irreparable harm occurs." So what do we begin to do with these definitions? How do we begin to bring these definitions home? Typically, the emotion of anger is okay for us to feel and express. There is no taboo culturally against us showing that we are angry, against us as men showing that we're angry or being aggressive. But as Christians, though, a lot of times we try not to be angry. We try to follow after Ecclesiastes, where it says to not have a spirit of anger. And we try to follow after Paul's command to be angry and sin not. So we most times just try not to get angry in the first place. But things happen and people do things that cause us to be angry. People hurt us or they threaten to hurt us, and it causes an anger in us. We experience this, and it's impossible to go through life not experiencing anger. Things at work make us angry. Things at home make us angry. Things at church even grieve us and make us angry. We have to know our anger. We have to know how it makes us feel, and we have to know how we react when we become angry. We have to know the actions that we default to in those situations, whether it be getting passionate and loud and boisterous or shutting down and resorting to silence and just trying to get away from it. We have to know. I mean, what about being hangry? Have you ever gotten angry easily when you were hungry or even tired? Things affect us. Let's turn a little bit and let's dig a little bit deeper into anger, go a little bit further and look at what triggers this emotion. We discussed a little bit earlier that anger is brought on by an interference, but we also get angry when we see or we perceive things like injustice. We get angry when there's an attempted harm to ourselves or to a loved one. We get angry when another person's angry at us. We reciprocate anger. We get angry because of a betrayal or abandonment or rejection. We also get angry like the Pharisees may have gotten angry at the observation of the breaking of a law or a cultural rule. Someone breaking in line, we might get angry. Anger is listed as an actual negative basic emotion. A lot of people say that it's a negative emotion. But anger can actually be useful when it's motivated by compassion and when it is expressed with discernment. In order to make our anger constructive, we want to focus on the actions of others and not on the others, not on the people that are doing the things that are making us angry. When we use Jesus as our example, when we go back and use him, when we look at Mark 3:5, his anger came out of his grief, that his passion was not matched by the Pharisees, and that their hearts were so hard to those that were around them that they were not willing to see other ways or other things in the world. We must know our triggers. We must know the things that cause that anger to rise in us the most. A lot of this is just seeing what's inside of us. To bring this home, we must practice constructive anger and use this quote unquote negative emotion in a positive way to build the relationships that are around us. We build the relationships using constructive anger by finding the thing that has caused our anger and then addressing that thing that made us angry and why it made us angry with the other individual. It may be something that this other individual does that they have no idea that it bothers you or makes you angry. This applies with every single relationship that we have. It applies with our wives, our kids, other men in our lives. When we begin to identify these triggers and how we respond to them in our day-to-day lives, then we can begin to adjust our life to decrease the anger and increase our ability to respond positively when we do get angry. Once again, let's look back at Jesus' response. Jesus didn't get belligerent and cuss out the Pharisees and tell them to get out of his sight or to go jump in a lake. Yes, he defied them, but he defied them in a controlled manner that brought positive change to the paralyzed man's life and was also in accordance with God's law and intention. Jesus' act of defiance caused no actual harm to the Pharisees, but we do see that they actually could have perceived harm to the cultural laws and then reciprocated that anger back on Jesus. Turning a little bit once again, looking at another aspect of anger, it's something that occurs natural in me. Like I mentioned earlier, though, Paul tells us to be angry and sin not. And then the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, tells us not to have an angry spirit. What is all this stuff? How do we bring all this stuff together? So an angry spirit is to be easily provoked to anger, as Ecclesiastes 7 and 9 describes. We may sometimes interpret this concept in Ecclesiastes to mean that having an angry spirit is to be angry at any time at all, to be angry whenever or wherever. But this is not the case. Having an angry spirit is to be overcome or to be ruled by anger. When our anger is consistent in our lives or we are defined by anger, then we have a spirit of anger. You see, we're not meant to be Bruce Banner.
That's my secret, Captain. I'm always angry.
We're not meant to be angry all the time. That's not supposed to be our secret. We don't want to have anger that persists. Like we discussed in earlier lessons, emotions are momentary. They last only seconds or minutes. They're not meant to last and persist longer than that. Having a spirit of anger is stewing in the events that triggered our anger. It's allowing grudges and bitterness to form out of those events. When we don't resolve the hurts that caused our anger in the first place, then anger begins to rise out of them every time that we replay them in our minds. It compounds each time we replay it. It causes the deeper anger to arise more easily. We can be set off on a hair trigger. So how do we keep from developing the spirit of anger? In order to keep from developing this, we must focus on resolving the anger. Paul says to be angry and sin not. We don't want to feel guilty or shameful about being angry. But we can't stay there, and we can't sin when we are angry. We can't let the anger lead us to sin. When our boss acts unjustly towards us or towards a coworker, we have to find a way to resolve it and to move past it. When your kids leave the Legos on the floor and you end up with the worst pain ever, you can't let it remain in you and remain mad at them. You have to resolve your anger, and we can begin to resolve our anger in 3 ways. First, and I know I talked about the same thing with sadness, and we've said the same thing with the other emotions, but this really is the best way to deal with these things, is to discuss it with God. Take your feeling to Him in prayer. As soon as you can, when you're angry or after you're angry, pray about it and ask God to show you what it was that triggered this emotion in the first place. Ask God to show you how you reacted to that anger. Ask Him to help you heal from the offense or to overcome the dissatisfaction that you felt. Secondly, go to the individual, discuss it with them. Many things can be resolved positively when you tell whoever did whatever made you angry that you were mad. It's okay to admit these things, and relationships can grow when we do admit these things. Not everyone wants to hurt you just for the fact of hurting you. Sometimes they do it without knowing it. Lastly, a way that we can work to resolve that anger is we can have an outlet for the adrenaline that commonly occurs with anger. Physical activity is a great release for the adrenaline, whether that be working out or going for a run or going for a bike ride, slinging some kettlebells around, or doing some aggressive gardening. When we deal with the physical effects that go with anger in a healthy manner, then we can begin to think more clearly about wise ways to deal with the situations that we find ourselves in. So quick little recap. Anger is an emotion that happens in us naturally. It's not something to be ashamed about. It's not something to feel guilty about when it does happen. We just want to make sure that we are reacting to it appropriately and that we're not flying off the handle or going crazy. We want to make sure that we are being angry and sinning not. We want to make sure that we are constructively using our anger to build relationships and instead of allowing that anger to tear relationships apart. And we must resolve our anger. We're not meant to stay in an angry mindset. We're not meant to be angry all the time. We have to resolve it by prayer, by fasting, by working through it with the people that made us angry, by paying attention to our health and the way that anger makes us feel, and making sure that we are resolving that anger. So a couple of questions about that anger that I think can help us dig deeper into what it is that we actually feel throughout this week. So this week, pay attention to, or even from the past week, describe a moment of anger that's as it relates to your kids, as it relates to your family. When was a moment that you got angry at your family or angry at your kids? And were you disappointed in how you responded to that anger? Were you disappointed in your reaction to that? Or did you actually act in a manner that was constructive? And then the other question this week is, what's something that makes you angry easily? It could be something like road rage, somebody cutting you off, somebody cutting in line. What's something that you find that when you see happening, that you just have that anger rise up and you have yourself getting angry and then reacting in some sort of way? What's that something or some things that make you angry easily? So I hope that this lesson has been helpful. I hope that it gives you some things to think about and work on in this upcoming week. I pray that God would bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next week.